The humble knot. Knots are everywhere. From when you tie your shoes in the morning, to when a surgeon repairs a wound, to when you pull your earbuds out of your pocket. Knots seem to be everywhere surrounding us. However, in 2019, it's easy to forget that knots even exist. I mean, we don't go around tying a great variety of them in our everyday lives. But that doesn't mean they aren't important. I learned about knots during my time in Boy Scouts. And while I certainly don't sit around practicing knots anymore, I still find that I remember a lot of the ones I learned long ago because they come up again and again in my daily life and they're so useful in a variety of circumstances. In this speech, I hope to give you some context as to how knots developed over time and the history of knots, as well as teaching you some knots that I learned in Boy Scouts and you can apply to your life. In order to understand why knots are so important today, we have to analyze their development over time. The first knots ever tied are probably lost to time. In fact, according to a 2014 piece in the New York Times Magazine by journalist Judy Rosen, humans might not have even been the animals that invented knots. She states that some scientists believe that gorillas were the first to use knots in order to create their shelters out of plant materials. But what we do know, Rosen continues, is that knots predate both the axe and the wheel in the genealogy of human tool development. In fact, it's really hard to say when the first knots came to be because they were tied so long ago that the materials that were used were probably decomposed over time. In fact, according to a 2019 expose by the Mariners Museum and Library Gallery on knot expert Henry Bushby, the first knots were probably tied out of plant fibers, animal skin, or even human hair. This exhibit goes on to say that we don't know exactly how old knots are, but we do know that they're so old that the ancient Mayans used knots to help develop their mathematical system. As ancient times continued on, the age of sea exploration led to a golden age of knot tying. There's many uses for knots on the high seas, according to the Mariners Museum and Library Gallery expose. Whether it's tying up the giant sails on ships that were used to explore the ocean, tying a ship to anchor, or even creating the hammocks that early explorers would have slept in, knots seem to be everywhere in ocean exploration. In fact, the first ever English manual for sea exploration was written in 1627 and included 3 knots: the sheepshank, wall knot, and bowline knot. These were just the first of many that would be developed, refined, and perfected over the years by seafarers, greatly increasing the world's knowledge of knots. As the age of exploration gave way to modern times, knots have found their way into many aspects of modern life. According to Judy Rosen's aforementioned piece for the New York Times, in 1944, the Bible for knot experts was written, the Ashley Book of Knots, which includes descriptions and guides to tying hundreds and hundreds of different knots. As time goes on, knots seem to appear everywhere, whether it's the electric harnesses on satellites up in space, or the waistband on your sweatpants on a lazy Sunday. History has led us to a world full of knots. Now that we know some of the history of knots, we can learn a few knots for ourselves. I've selected 4 knots that I learned in Boy Scouts that have different purposes and are relatively simple to tie to help demonstrate how important knots are and how they can be used in a variety of different circumstances. The first knot I want to showcase today is the square knot. This is a really easy knot to tie and untie, and it can be used to tie one rope into a loop or tie 2 loops together. According to the U.S. Army Field Manual on Rigging Techniques, Procedures, and Applications by Mark Herkomer, this knot is very good for general use and is weakest when using to tie together 2 differently sized ropes or tying together a rope in wet conditions. We tie the square knot by taking one end of a rope and passing it over the other and then back under like so. Then taking the other one, passing it over and under in the opposite direction to form a knot that looks like a square. This knot is reversible, meaning you can go right over left or left over right. Really easy to tie, and if tied correctly, should slide in and out like that. I learned this and all the other knot explanations that I use in the speech today from a 2016 article from Scouting Magazine entitled How to Tie 10 Essential Scouting Knots by Cliff Jacobson. It's a great article and has handy guides on how to tie knots if you want to go back and learn more. The second knot I want to show is a similar one to the square knot in that it's used to tie 2 ropes together, but highlights why it's important to know a variety of different knots. This knot is called the sheet bend. Once again, according to the Rigging Techniques, Applications, and Procedures Manual, this knot is used to join 2 ropes together and is much stronger than the square knot, as well as being much better in conditions such as the rope being wet, and especially when the ropes are differently sized. Again, according to Cliff Jacobson's article in Scouting Magazine, we tie the sheep in like so. Using our larger rope, we form a U shape like this, and then pass the smaller rope in through the loop. The smaller rope is then tied in a big loop all the way around the U, like so, and then passed in between the two ropes, like this, for a knot that should tighten to look something like this. The sheep bend is strong. It's a really good way to tie two ropes together in a way that you know they won't slip or break apart, and it's really handy. In fact, so handy that some version of the ancient Incas, according to the Mariners Museum and Library Gallery, was used to create the nets that they would use for hunting. But while the square knot and the sheep bend have somewhat different uses, they still do essentially the same thing, tie two ropes together. Which brings us to our third knot, the bowline knot. The real advantage of knowing a lot of different knots is you can use them in different circumstances, and the bowline knot is a great example of this. According to the U.S. Army Field Manual previously referenced, it's a really strong loop that doesn't slip or tighten under a lot of strain, which makes it handy if you're in any situation where you need something that's going to be really strong but still easy to untie after applying a lot of force. Once again, according to Cliff Jacobson's article in Scouting, we tie the bowline knot like so. As if tying a square knot, you pass right over left and then back under, as if you're tying about half of a square knot, but instead of completing it, you bring one strand up, take the other strand and loop it in front, and then pass it between the two ropes, like so. Once tightened, the bowline knot should look something like this and form a very sturdy loop that won't tighten the knot as more force is applied. In fact, according to the Scouting article, the bowline knot is often so strong that the knot won't break before the rope when more and more force is applied. The final knot that I want to showcase today is the timber hitch. According to arborist Mark Adams in a 2005 edition of the Arborist News, this knot goes by many different names and is a favorite of American tree climbers, and that's for good reason. The timber hitch is a really, really strong knot that's easily adjustable. Under tension, it won't slip, but if you give it a little bit of slack, you can slide it up and down on the rope. According to the U.S. Army Field Guide, hitches are a kind of knots that you use to fasten one thing to another, like a climber to a tree branch or a tent to a pole. And they're strong in tension, but this is particularly loose when given some slack. Finally, according to Cliff Jacobson's article once again, we tie the knot like so. First, loop it around whatever you wish to tie your hitch to. Then, take your free end of the rope, pass it in front, and then back behind and under itself to form one half hitch, like so. Then, go back under this hitch and do the exact same thing one more time to form two half hitches stacked right on top of each other, the second one under the first. Finally, go above these two, in front of the rope, behind, and back through to form your final half hitch. As you can see, the knot doesn't slip or slide on the rope when holding up the basket. But if given some slack, it's easy to slide the timber hitch across the rope. It's really great because it's adjustable. You can use this to hang things. It's especially useful in a variety of camping situations and just a generally great knot to know. While these 4 knots are only the tip of the iceberg for knot tying in general, they are intended to give you a good look into what the world of knots has to offer. By using the right knot in the right situation, you can use them as more of a tool than just a random way to connect 2 ropes. And I hope that by learning the history of knots from their early origins in ancient times, their golden age and sea exploration to modern day, and looking at 4 knots that have somewhat different uses, you've been inspired to treat knots with a little more respect. And next time you need to tie 2 things together, you don't haphazardly loop 2 ropes and hope that it holds, but recognize that knots are a tool that's underappreciated, but not any less important. Thank you.